My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 68 years old, a retired nurse, a widow, and until that morning, I believed I understood what safety felt like. I had just come back from a routine doctor's appointment, the kind you stop worrying about once you've had enough of them. The nurse had joked about my age. I'd smiled politely, and I'd driven home thinking about what to make for lunch. Nothing in the day felt unusual. Nothing warned me that my life had already been rearranged without my consent. When I stepped into my kitchen, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet. Empty quiet. The coffee pot was cold. The air felt untouched. Then my eyes landed on a piece of paper taped neatly to the dining table. Blue painter's tape. Careful. Deliberate. It was my son Daniel's handwriting. I knew it the way only a mother can. Slanted just slightly. Rushed. Confident. Mom, we flew to Miami. Please don't call. We need some space. I read it once. Then again. Miami wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a spontaneous trip. It was distance, chosen on purpose. And the words, "don't call," didn't sound like a request. They sounded like a decision already made. I didn't sit down. I didn't reach for my phone. I walked straight down the hallway, my coat still on, my purse still on my shoulder. The carpet felt familiar under my shoes. Too familiar. As if this house believed it knew me better than my own child did. In my bedroom closet, behind winter coats I hadn't worn in years, was a small safe. I'd opened it countless times before, always with the same quiet reassurance that comes from knowing you've prepared for emergencies. That morning, it opened just as easily. Inside, there was nothing, no envelopes, no documents, no savings I had built over decades of night shifts, missed holidays, and careful restraint, just empty metal and my own reflection staring back at me. I closed the safe slowly, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. In that moment, standing alone in my bedroom, I understood something with painful clarity. Daniel hadn't gone to Miami to get away from life. He'd gone because he believed I no longer had one worth protecting. I stayed in that bedroom longer than I meant to, not because I was frozen, but because I needed to listen to my own thoughts without interruption. At my age, panic doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in, testing the edges of what you're willing to face. I sat on the edge of the bed, rested my hands on my knees, and breathed the way I used to teach patients who were certain something terrible was about to happen. Slow enough to think. Slow enough not to break. When I finally stood up, I closed the closet door and walked back into the kitchen. The note was still there, unmoved, as if it expected me to argue with it. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it standing up, noticing how steady my hands were. That steadiness wasn't courage, it was habit. Decades of working double shifts had trained my body to function even when my heart hadn't caught up yet. Daniel hadn't always been like this. That was the thought that hurt the most. After my husband passed, the house had felt too large, too quiet, like every sound echoed longer than it should. Daniel started calling more often then. He'd stop by after work, bring groceries, fix small things I'd been putting off. He didn't rush me. He didn't push. He sat at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things, and I let myself believe that grief had pulled us closer instead of simply making me easier to manage. Lauren came into the picture not long after. She had a soft voice and an attentive smile, the kind that made people feel seen. She remembered my doctor's appointments, asked about my sleep, offered to help with paperwork I no longer enjoyed dealing with. When she suggested organizing my bills online, it felt practical, even kind. I told myself this was what supportive families looked like. The first time Daniel asked about my finances, it sounded reasonable. He said it worried him that everything was on my shoulders. He said he just wanted to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. I remember hesitating for a moment, my fingers resting on the edge of the table, feeling a small knot of discomfort I couldn't quite explain. I ignored it. I told myself that trust was something you didn't ration with your own child. From there, the changes were subtle. He asked for account access so he could keep an eye on things. Lauren suggested I stop driving at night because my reaction time might not be what it used to be. Decisions started being made for me instead of with me, always framed as concern, always wrapped in polite language. I didn't notice the shift all at once. It happened the way erosion does, quietly, over time. When I moved into their house, it felt temporary at first, just until I felt less lonely, just until things stabilized. My room was small but clean. I told myself I didn't need much space anymore. I adjusted my routines to fit theirs, ate when they ate, slept when the house went quiet. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a guest and became a responsibility. Money started leaving my account more often. The explanations came easily. A car repair, a business opportunity, a short-term loan that would be paid back. Each reason sounded urgent enough not to question, reasonable enough not to refuse, and every time I considered pushing back, I saw the way Daniel's jaw tightened, the way Lauren's smile thinned just slightly. I chose peace over confrontation, again and again. The night everything changed. I wasn't looking for answers. I'd woken up thirsty and gone to the kitchen for water, barefoot, half asleep. The house was dim, the television off, but voices drifted in from the living room. Daniel's voice was low. Lauren's carried an edge I hadn't heard before. I stopped in the hallway without meaning to. They were talking about me. Not unkindly, not angrily, but as if I were a problem that needed solving. Lauren mentioned a nursing home, one she'd researched. Daniel said it would be easier once I was settled, that I wouldn't notice the difference. Miami came up again, spoken with excitement, with relief. I stood there, unseen, my glass of water untouched in my hand, and felt something inside me settle into place. It wasn't fear, it was clarity. I went back to my room without making a sound. I lay awake until morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd dismissed, every doubt I'd buried. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't angry, I wasn't confused, I was awake. And I understood that if I didn't protect myself now, no one else was going to do it for me. After that night, I didn't change my behavior all at once. I knew better than that. Sudden resistance would have raised questions. And questions were the one thing I couldn't afford. Instead, I became quieter. Not withdrawn, just less present in the ways that mattered to them. I asked fewer questions at the table. When Lauren corrected me, I let her. When Daniel spoke for me, I didn't interrupt. I allowed small misunderstandings to pass, even when I knew the truth. It was painful in ways I hadn't expected, not because I felt powerless, but because I had to pretend I was. They mistook my silence for confusion. What they didn't realize was that I was paying attention to everything. I started keeping a small notebook in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. It wasn't hidden particularly well, because it didn't need to be. To them, it looked like the kind of thing an aging woman might use to jot down reminders she didn't trust herself to remember. Grocery items, appointment times, a phone number written twice, just in case. What I actually wrote were dates, words, shifts in tone. I noted when Daniel sounded rushed and when he sounded rehearsed. I noticed how Lauren's concerns sharpened whenever money came up. I wrote down the times they spoke about my future as if I weren't in the room, not every day, just often enough to see a pattern form. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It was the restraint. There were moments when I wanted to confront them, to ask outright how they could do this to me. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I had failed somehow, if I had raised my son to see love as something he could convert into leverage. Those thoughts crept in quietly, usually after the house had gone still. I reminded myself of something I'd learned long ago in nursing. Reacting too soon often makes the damage worse. When I finally reached out to Thomas Reed, I did it from the parking lot of a grocery store, sitting in my car with the engine off, and I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since his mother passed. I chose him because he'd once trusted me with the most vulnerable part of his life, and because he knew what it meant to listen. I didn't tell him how I felt. I told him what had happened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked a few careful questions, not accusatory, not dramatic, just precise. He explained my options slowly, making sure I understood each one. He didn't promise a clean outcome. He promised clarity. That was enough. From then on, everything moved deliberately. I didn't take actions that would draw attention. I didn't confront missing funds. I didn't accuse. I let Daniel believe his control was complete. Because people who believe they've won stop being careful. Lauren became bolder as the months passed. She scheduled appointments without asking me. She spoke to doctors as if she were my voice. Daniel stopped pretending to consult me about financial decisions altogether. He told me what was happening instead of asking. Each change hurt. Each one also confirmed what I already knew. The day Daniel told me there was an emergency, I recognized the tone immediately. It was urgency wrapped in familiarity, concern sharpened just enough to push me into agreement. He said they needed access to what remained of my savings. He said it was temporary. He said it was important. I looked at him across the kitchen table and nodded. Signing those papers felt heavier than I expected, not because I didn't understand what I was doing, but because I did. I knew this was the moment they would remember as the final step, the proof that I was exactly who they thought I was. I let them have that belief. When Daniel and Lauren left for Miami a few days later, they hugged me quickly. Lauren told me to rest. Daniel told me not to worry. They didn't notice how calm I was. They didn't ask why. By the time their plane took off, I was sitting alone in my room, the notebook closed, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. All that was left was to wait and to see who would finally understand that disappearing is not the same thing as giving up control. The morning Daniel and Lauren landed in Miami, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I was nervous, but because my body had already adjusted to the idea that this day was different. Worry keeps you restless. Waiting, I've learned, is quieter. It lets you breathe. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window while it brewed, watching the sky slowly lighten. For a moment, I thought about how many mornings I had started this way over the years, getting ready for work, getting ready for responsibilities that never asked whether I felt ready or not. That routine steadiness had carried me through grief, through exhaustion, through years when I didn't think much about myself at all. It carried me now. I wasn't at the airport, and I never intended to be. This was not a scene that needed witnesses. It wasn't about shock or embarrassment. It was about consequence, and consequence doesn't require an audience. By late morning, my phone rang. Thomas's name appeared on the screen. His voice, when I answered, was calm and even, exactly as it had been every time we spoke. He told me there had been a delay with Daniel and Lauren's travel plans. He said they had been asked to step aside so some questions could be clarified. He didn't say more than that. I thanked him, hung up, and sat at the table with my hands folded in front of me. For a few minutes, I waited for something dramatic to rise inside me. Satisfaction, relief, a sense of victory. None of it came. What I felt instead was a quiet heaviness, like the moment after a long illness when you realize recovery doesn't mean forgetting what you've survived. An hour later, Thomas called again. This time, His tone shifted slightly, not emotional, just more resolved. He explained that the financial records had raised concerns, that the documentation we'd prepared was now being reviewed. He didn't describe the process in detail. He didn't need to. I understood enough to know there was no simple explanation Daniel and Lauren could offer their way out of. According to Thomas, Daniel was confused at first. He kept insisting there had been some mistake, that everything had been done with my permission. Lauren tried to step in, to smooth things over, to explain how they'd only been helping. They presented themselves the way they always had, reasonable, responsible, slightly burdened by circumstances beyond their control. That approach works when there's doubt. There was no doubt anymore. Later that afternoon, Daniel asked to speak with me. Thomas checked first, careful not to push. I told him I would take the call. Avoiding it wouldn't protect me, and I had spent too many months protecting everyone else. When the video connected, the camera shook briefly before settling. I saw the ceiling of an airport office, harsh fluorescent light reflecting off white tiles. Then Daniel's face filled the screen. He looked older than I remembered. Not tired exactly, but smaller. Like the confidence he'd been wearing no longer fit him. He said my name the way he used to when he was a child, unsure, stretching the sound as if it might still bring comfort. He asked what was happening. He asked why this was happening. His voice cracked slightly, more from confusion than fear. I let him finish. Then I spoke. I told him I had never been confused. I told him I had heard the conversations. He assumed I was too weak, too distracted, or too diminished to understand. I told him I knew about the nursing home he had researched, about the way my life had been reduced to a problem that needed solving. I told him Miami wasn't an accident, and neither was the timing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of being cruel. I told him something simpler, something harder to argue with. I told him that love doesn't give you ownership, for the first time in a long while. Daniel didn't interrupt me. He didn't defend himself. He didn't look to Lauren for help. He just listened, his eyes fixed on the screen, as if hearing me clearly required more effort than he had ever given before. Lauren remained just out of view. I could hear her breathing, controlled and shallow. She never spoke. I think she understood then that this wasn't a situation she could manage with the right tone or the right words. When the call ended, the screen went dark, and I stayed where I was, staring at my own reflection for a long moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt emptied, the way you do after setting down something heavy you've been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. That evening, I went for a walk through my neighborhood. The air was warm. Someone down the street was watering their lawn. A couple walked past me, laughing quietly. Life moved forward without hesitation, indifferent to the quiet collapse of something that had once mattered deeply to me. And I realized then that this was what justice actually felt like. Not loud, not dramatic, just real. Miami had never been the end of my story. It was only the place where Daniel and Lauren stopped being able to pretend that mine didn't exist. The weeks after everything settled were quieter than I had imagined. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after a long illness, when the body has survived but hasn't yet learned what normal feels like again. Phone calls came through Thomas, spaced out, efficient, unemotional. He updated me when it was necessary and left the rest alone. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. There were hearings, statements, and decisions that moved forward without me needing to sit in every room or hear every word. I learned the outcomes the way people my age often do, indirectly, through summaries, through the calm voices of professionals who know how to separate fact from feeling. Daniel faced consequences for what he had done. Lauren faced her own. Nothing dramatic, Nothing cinematic, just the slow, deliberate work of accountability. Someone asked me once if I felt relieved. I had to think about that. Relief suggests a weight being lifted all at once, like setting down a heavy bag and walking away lighter. What I felt was different. What I felt was clarity. The fog that had followed me for years, through grief, through doubt, through quiet compromises, finally lifted. I could see what had happened without needing to soften it or explain it away. Clear doesn't mean comfortable. Clear means honest. I sold my house that fall, not because it held bad memories, and not because I was trying to erase the past. I sold it because it no longer fit the life I was choosing. The house had been built for a version of me that centered everyone else first. I wanted something smaller, something simpler, something that didn't echo with expectations I no longer carried. My new place was modest and bright. It took time to learn its rhythms, the way the light moved across the living room in the afternoon, the quiet creak of the balcony door when the air shifted. I planted herbs in small pots and found comfort in tending to something that responded only to patience and care. I cooked meals just for myself and ate them slowly, without rushing, without apologizing for the silence. People like to believe that justice repairs what was broken. It doesn't. Justice doesn't restore trust once it's been dismantled piece by piece. It doesn't give you back the version of your child you remember from years ago, before adulthood complicated everything. It doesn't undo the moments you dismissed because love told you to be understanding, because fear told you to stay quiet. What justice does give you is permission. Permission to stop doubting yourself. Permission to stop asking whether you imagine the harm. Permission to stand still in the truth without needing anyone else to validate it. For a long time, I replayed conversations in my head, wondering where things had turned. I questioned my instincts, my decisions, my willingness to overlook discomfort in the name of family. That questioning faded once the truth was acknowledged out loud. Once the facts were placed where they belonged, there was nothing left to argue with myself about. I don't speak about Daniel often now, not because I'm angry. Anger is loud, and what I feel is quiet. What I feel is the understanding that some losses don't announce themselves. They arrive gently, wrapped in familiarity, and they stay. There is no ceremony for losing a relationship to betrayal. There is only acceptance. There are days when I miss him, not the man he became, but the boy he once was. I allow that grief its space. I don't rush it away. At this stage of life, I know better than to pretend that not feeling something makes you stronger. It doesn't. It just makes you smaller. What surprised me most was how much I learned about myself after everything ended. For years. I believed dignity meant keeping the peace. It meant not being difficult, not asking too many questions, not making other people uncomfortable. I believed that aging gracefully meant stepping aside quietly, trusting that those who claimed to love you would do right by you. That belief didn't come from weakness. It came from conditioning. I understand now that dignity has nothing to do with silence. Dignity is knowing when silence protects you and when it erases you. It's recognizing that patience is not permission, and that being needed is not the same as being valued. Growing older does not mean surrendering your agency. It does not mean handing over your voice or your choices or your right to exist fully in your own life. If anything, age sharpens the understanding of what matters and what never did. In the evenings, I sometimes sit on my balcony and watch the lights come on in the surrounding buildings. Behind each window is a life unfolding. Arguments, reconciliations, quiet dinners, disappointments left unspoken. I know now how ordinary harm can look from the outside, how easily it hides behind routine and familiarity. If there is one thing I hope people understand when they hear my story, it's this. Danger doesn't always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes softly, wearing concern, asking you to trust it just one more time. And survival doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like standing still long enough to see clearly, then choosing yourself without apology. I didn't disappear. I stayed. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, and final, is what saved me.